Hey, I'm Chris Buskirk. He is Seth Leaps, and our guest in this hour is Brandon Weichert. He is a contributing editor to American Greatness and the proprietor of the Weichert Report. You can find that at theweichertreport.com. Brandon, welcome back.
How you doing?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I am fantastic. I spent the last week being called a Putin-lover, so it's been fun.
Was that meant as a compliment or a slur?
No, clearly it was a slur, and I took umbrage with it. But
now, why were you called a Putin lover?
Well,
did you have Russian dressing on your pastrami?
I down it with some vodka. No, I have a lot of those Russian nesting dolls everywhere. No, I'm kidding.
Caviar. It's your caviar intake.
No, I gave a lecture at the Institute of World Politics, and I said that Russia was not the threat that our intelligence agencies were making it out to be, or rather that our media and two intelligence agencies were making it out to be, and I explained why, and they didn't like what they heard. So, but it's been
well,
fun.
Okay, you brought it up. Okay, what are the two agencies, and why is Russia not the threat that they're making it out to be?
Well, the two agencies are the big ones that we've been hearing, the CIA and the DIA now. I would also add probably the FBI. We've been dealing, obviously, with Russian espionage, but we've been dealing with that since the 1930s. And so, I mean, it's nothing new. And what I said, the issue with the threat is that, yes, Putin's a pain in our neck, but if you look at the demographic charts of Russia, their fertility rates have been collapsing for 40 years. They are in a hopeless tailspin. Their economy's in free fall because they're married to the petrodollar, and the price of oil has been, plummeting generally. And they're basically, Putin's in a race against time. And his big issue is he wants to stabilize his western periphery, that's the border with Europe. He wants to stabilize the southern periphery so he can extract energy from the Middle East. And then he wants to pivot to the east because he's scared, out of his mind that China's going to gobble up that resource-rich Far Eastern Siberian area. And so I said that if you're sitting in the Kremlin, yeah, you're worried about America and you're going to keep poking us in the eye when you think we're doing something wrong. But your big threat is you want to stabilize relations with the U.S. and focus on China. And they didn't like that. It was, I guess, too reasonable, too based in history. I don't know.
And the population of Russia is 144 million.
Yeah, it's 146 million now that they've added Crimea. So compare that to America. And that's
I'm not supposed to laugh when you say that, right?
Well, I certainly do when I read it, because when you just look at the breakdown, you go, this is, and then if you look at the health of the population, the average male life expectancy from birth in Russia is 64 years of age. That's if you're lucky. Women in Russia are at 74, but compare that to, say, Poland. Women in Poland, they're at 80. So Russia is
what are men in Poland?
They're, I don't know, actually. I should.
But presumably the same sort of order of magnitude higher.
Yeah, it's insane. And so if you're Putin, rather than looking at Putin as Stalin Part 2, I'm looking at him as the last sultan of the Ottoman Empire desperately trying to cling on. And, as I said in my lecture, and they didn't like this either, I said that, just like the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe in the last century, and the British and the French were desperately trying to keep it together because they didn't want to deal with the aftermath of what happens when it collapses, I said the same thing is true of Russia today. It's the sick man of Eurasia, and we should be trying to figure out how best to stabilize relations with Putin, because whatever comes after Putin is going to be a lot worse, whether it's the dissolution of Russia or if it's the complete a new Putin-type character taking over, who would probably be this guy, Viktor Zolotov, who's even worse. And so nobody wanted to hear it, though. It was
even worse, meaning what?
It could be an Islamist, because they have a largely rising population of Muslims there, which that in and of itself is not a problem. But the fact is, you have the return of these guys who were fighting in ISIS. They're coming back to Russia. There's about 2,200 ISIS fighters. They're all coming back into Russia. They're reintegrating with the local Russian Muslim populations. You've got this guy, Kardyev, running Chechnya, who's Putin's guy, but Kardyev is a fanatical Islamist himself, and he's out there slaughtering the gays in Chechnya and the LGBTQ community. And so this is, the alternatives to Putin in Russia are either complete collapse of the Russian state, which is going to be terrible, or you're going to get another strong man who's even more bloody-minded, or you could even get a jihadist.
Are you suggesting Zolotov is sympathetic to the Islamists, or that he is one himself?
Well, Zolotov is tight with the Islamist leader in Chechnya because the Islamist leader in Chechnya is Putin's pick, and so Zolotov is a Putin crony. He's worked with Putin since the 1980s. And Zolotov is not an Islamist. No, I'm saying Zolotov would be like Putin, only times 10. But the other guy in Chechnya, the Islamist, he's even crazier. I mean, Mike Tyson loves this guy. So whoever Mike Tyson loves, I tend to be a little suspicious of. But that's what I've been dealing with all week.
Brandon, it strikes me that that longer term the strategic competitor, I will not use the term enemy, but certainly the strategic competitor to the United States is not Russia, it's China.
Yes.
Right? And so
I would use the word enemy.
I'm content with that. I'm content with that word. That may be I don't have a problem with it. I'll put it that way. But right now, they're not an open enemy. They are a veiled enemy, right? They are certainly a strategic competitor of the United States. Is it not? Is it not a self-evident truth that we ought to be working in order to counter that threat, and a good way to do that is to try and have amicable working relationships with the major powers that border China?
Yeah, it is to me. It is to Henry Kissinger. I don't know anybody else in D.C. You guys just published.
Well, you're in good company. You and Henry Kissinger.
Yeah, well, that's what I said at the lecture I gave. I said, look, if I find that it's me and Henry Kissinger, I think I'm in good company for the most part. I said, but I just published a piece with American Greatness. You guys just published it about an hour ago. On how I thought this sanctions deal that Trump signed was the worst deal Trump has ever made in his life. I cannot believe he ceded that much power to the to the legislative branch, which is universally opposed to the Trump administration. And I was in shock that he allowed sanctions to go through, which literally gave the ability to lift those sanctions, which is usually reserved for the president. He gave that ability over to Congress, which not only is going to devastate our ability to conduct relations with Russia, it's also going to forever diminish the role of the presidency, of the executive branch, in a traditional foreign policy realm, in this case, diplomacy. Now, we can talk about, how we don't want to have the president going willy-nilly into war, as happened under Bush and Clinton and all the other modern presidents, but this is diplomacy that we're talking about, which is usually, historically, and actually legally under their statutes that I linked to in the article, that allow for the president to pretty much have, full control over who we sanction. He has to consult with Congress, of course, but who we sanction, and most certainly, once sanctions are imposed, he alone is the determiner of how those sanctions and when those sanctions get pulled off. And now, under this new deal that Trump did with Congress, it's all in Congress's hands, and Congress is beyond dysfunctional. So, I mean, it's not good.
Brandon, I want to go back to something you sort of alluded to earlier, which is Putin's policy vis-a-vis the Islamists on his borders. What exactly is the Putin policy with regard to Islamists inside Russia, and then the ones that are across the border?
Well, it's all connected. They're all connected. So his policy so you have to understand, as I said in my lecture, the largest Muslim population in quote-unquote Europe, because since we're expanding the definition right now to include Moscow, is not in London, it's not in Paris, it's not in Brussels, it's in Moscow. There are 1 million Muslim Russians in Moscow and an additional 1.5 million migrant worker Muslims living in Moscow. So
2.5 million.
Yeah. And so Moscow has the largest Muslim population in Europe, and it's growing. And they say that by the middle of the century, 2050, I think it's going to be a little earlier if you look at the fertility rates, that the Muslim Russian population will account for about 30% of the population of Russia. And so Putin looks out the Kremlin window and he sees this, and he remembers he just fought 2 brutal wars against Chechnya, which is a Russian, mostly Muslim province. And he doesn't want to repeat that because he knows that in southern Russia, which is the part with all the Muslims for the most part, in southern Russia, he's got young Muslim men. Now, he's managed to stabilize Russia's relationship with its Muslim population. But if he goes too far in the Middle East in terms of pushing against jihadists, he's got to be very cognizant of the fact that he could start to have a destabilizing effect on the politics, on that kind of quasi-stability that exists right now between the Muslim Russian population and the non-Muslim Russian population.
Brandon, let me just break there, just because we have to go to a commercial break. But I want to ask you this: you can think about it through the break, which is we talk about the declining demographics inside of Russia. Where is the growth coming from? In other words, is what meager growth there is within Russia, is it coming from ethnic Russians, or is it coming from the Muslim population in the south? Let's pick up on that on the other side of this break. I am Chris Buskirk. He is Seth Leibson, but he is out today. He'll be back tomorrow. Our guest is Brandon Weichert. He's a contributing editor at American Greatness, a frequent contributor, by the way, at American Greatness. We appreciate that. And the proprietor of the WeichertReport.com. You can catch up with Brandon at both locations, amgreatness.com and the WeichertReport.com. Brandon, when we were going to the break, I was asking you about just demographics in Russia because, as we like to say, demographics is destiny. And I pulled up the demographic chart of Russia after World War II. It's shocking, actually. We read about these things and you see the numbers in isolation, but the fertility rate in Russia turned negative in 1992. Yeah. It's only been positive for 3 out of the past 25 years.
Yeah.
And in those years it was just barely 0.2. It was 2013, 14, and 15, 0.2 fertility rate. In 2016, it was at 0. But for it, the Russian population peaked in 1992, actually,
yep.
and has been declining ever since. The fertility that they do have, and I guess I'm asking you a question about the demographic mix inside of Russia. Is that changing?
Oh, yeah. So you asked me going out into the last break. I will tell you the 2 fastest-growing populations in Russia in the Far East is the Chinese. For instance, in the last 18 months, the Russian Far East authorities were screaming that 1.5 million Chinese illegal immigrants have crossed into the border in the last 18 months.
How many? Say that again?
They're saying 1.5 million. Now, Carnegie Moscow Center is the only non-Russian entity in the West that has the ability to determine whether these claims are actual, and they're saying it's not as much. But because the reporting out of the Russian Far East is so underdeveloped that they just don't have the capabilities to do the kind of studies that, say, Moscow can do on its part of Russia. But the point is, it is sizable, and they're saying that by 2020 to 2030, that the Russian Far East will be predominantly ethnic Chinese, and majority of those Chinese living there are illegal immigrants. They're not going there to become good Russian citizens. They're going there to make some money, marry a Russian woman, because there are greater levels of Russian women in Russia than there are men, and there are greater levels of Chinese men than there are in China. So the poor Chinese living along the Russian border go across into Russia, and they're basically slowly, silently invading. And the plan, I think, however stated it is or organized it is, I think the logic is that within another 20 years, that part of Russia will become China. And then the other major ethnic group that's exploding in terms of population is the Muslim group from mostly southern Russia. And so you have these 2 groups that are gaining influence, and it's interesting to watch as an academic. Of course, as an American national security person, I get very worried because if China takes that large part, the Siberian part of Russia, they're going to get not only all the weapons there, but they're going to get, more importantly, all those resources. Or if Russia becomes a somewhat Muslim country, the risk is that a radical element of jihadists may take over Russian government and get their hands on those nukes and God knows what else. And so in the near term, Russia has some problems, but in the long term, this could be seriously complicating for American foreign policy.
And so this has been written about for years, which is the idea of these sort of silent invasions. You know, the invasions of what you might call the poor, the pathetic. They're not traditional invasions like we have seen military type invasions. It's just a mass migration of people which take over another country, another portion of a country. I guess that's sort of what you're describing on the Sino-Russian border.
Well, and also it's happening to a degree in the southern Russian component that has bordering the Muslim world as well. Because Putin, what he does is to make peace with the Muslims. For instance, like I said, in Chechnya, he's put this lunatic Kadyrov in power, and Kadyrov is he's a jihadist, but he happens to be a Russian nationalist as well. So Putin figures, as long as I have somebody who swears fealty to me, I don't care if they're also if they have leanings toward jihadism. I don't care as long as it's not directed against my regime in Moscow. It's a similar tack that you see taken in places like Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis look the other way while jihadists run amok, around the world, as long as they don't do their attacks in Saudi Arabia itself.
So what is Putin and the people around him who are advising him are undoubtedly aware of these demographic trends. Do you have a feel for what their perspective is on this or how they plan to deal with it?
Well, in terms of dealing with China, you've got two groups, and we'll use their terminology. The two groups that are advising Putin, they're all part of this group known as the Siloviki. And the Siloviki are these old, and they're not old, they're the old KGB guys, the military intelligence people, the holdovers from the Soviet Union, and they're part of that Putin cadre. They're like Putin in terms of their backgrounds. And then within that group, you have two camps. You have the Neo-Eurasianists, as led by Alexander Dugin, and Neo-Eurasianism is a very bizarre, fascist-like movement that wants to see Russia embrace its Asian heritage, align with China, create a Eurasian Union with Moscow as the lead, and it's very
good luck with that.
Yeah, exactly. And
144 million population versus 1.3 billion of population.
Well, and as I said in my lecture, and my lecture actually, it was also well received. It's just there was a handful of people, one of them from Hopkins, that was being very nasty toward me. But
was it Elliot Cohen?
No, but somebody of that. Somebody sounded like him, that's for sure. The thing about Russia is that there's also another group, and oddly enough, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, who comes across as a very staunch Russian nationalist, he's actually the leader of this Atlanticist group, and that's the group that favors stability and amicable relations and closer ties with the West. And if you look at that group, it's a kind of who's who, because they're Sergei Lavrov's Atlanticist group. They're all on the editorial board for a Council on Foreign Relations publication that's a subsidiary of the Foreign Affairs Journal, and I'm forgetting, it's Russia in the Global Today or something along those lines is the title of this publication. It's been there since the end of the Cold War, and in the editorial board is a who's who of the inner Putin cadre. And so I think for all of our rhetoric in America about how evil Putin is, and he's not a nice guy, and I think for all of the rhetoric coming out of Russia today about how Russia can't trust America, I think that within the halls of power at the Kremlin, I think there's a real chance for the United States and Europe to get a deal. And by the way, Europe wants to do business with Russia. And
Russia is large. It is militarily still powerful. It's a nuclear power.
But it's weak in every other way.
But it's weak in every other way. But it straddles Europe and Asia,
right.
And as a result, there's a natural conflict there. There's a natural geographic conflict, right. A natural strategic conflict.
And a historical conflict with China.
Right, and so the people who are paid to be this country's brain when it comes to foreign policy, to diplomacy, to national security, seem to be missing the forest for the trees here.
Right.
Can you stay for another segment, Brandon?
Yes, of course.
Let's pick this up on the other side. This is too important not to continue. I am Chris Buskirk. He is Seth Leibson. This is the Seth and Chris Show. We're joined by Brandon Weichert. Brandon is a contributing editor to American Greatness. Brandon, so the diplomatic, the strategic, even the economic and the military issues at stake with Russia? Does it become Atlanticist, or does it move east? Does it align with China, or with the South, frankly, or does it align with the Muslim world? Those seem to be of first order importance for United States national security over the long haul, and yet some of the geostrategic truths that seem self-evident to me are just outright rejected or ignored by our foreign policy establishment. Why do you think that is?
Well, because they hate Donald Trump.
Yeah,
that's what it is. It's cultural. There is a genuine cultural antipathy toward Donald Trump and anyone who even utters support for Donald Trump. And in terms of what you were talking about in the intro just now, Russia already is aligned to the south with Turkey and Iran. It's already aligning with the Muslim world, part of it. And then because of our actions, with the sanctions, with the constant rhetoric coming out of official Washington. Remember, the Russians, they don't, even though they may look like us and they may share a history with us, they do not fully comprehend the American political experience because they're not American. And so when you're the leader in the Kremlin and you're already a hyper-paranoid former KGB man who's sitting atop this cinder that is the Russian Federation, and you're hearing from both Republicans and Democrats every day for the last year about how Russia's the greatest threat that the world has ever seen, period, more so than jihadism, more so than China, more so even than climate change. Oh, boy. You are not going to be inclined to take the sensible route and do a deal with the West. You're going to move to your east. And if that means you become basically a junior partner to the Chinese, well, so what? Because you need the money. Your economy needs to sell those natural resources. And if the West can't or isn't buying them from you, enough of them the way they were before, you're going to start getting closer to China, which is very resource hungry. And you're going to try to also stick it to the West, which pushed you away and insulted you in the process. And so, I mean, we are our own worst enemies, and even the Europeans are saying, when I hear Jean-Claude Juncker, who's the EU High Commissioner, saying that if America he said this last month, if America enacts the new round of sanctions against Russia,
which we did,
right, and he said, I will protect European national interests and I will not uphold those sanctions. And I just thought that was hilarious because, first of all, the EU is a supranational body, and so to hear Juncker, the man who pushed David Cameron into Brexit, to hear Juncker talking about the national interests of the European members is hilarious.
Sure.
And it also shows you the economic ties and the geostrategic interests that Europe has with Russia. They're far greater, I would argue, even than with America. And this is a very precarious position. We are isolating ourselves on the world stage because our foreign policy elite can't stand the fact that Donald Trump is president instead of Jeb Bush or, God forbid, Hillary Clinton.
What do you think what is our interest with Russia long term, sort of medium and long term? What is in the American national security interest in terms of our relations with Russia?
Well, as I said yesterday, we're going to need to come up with contingencies, and we don't have any for the day that Russia collapses in on itself.
The way you say that, I take it you believe that that's a virtual certainty.
I think at this point the demographic reality is such that within 20 to 30 years we're not going to even recognize Russia, and by the middle of the century, 2050, I mean, who knows? I mean, I think that one way or the other, Russia's going to get cleaved apart, and we are pushing them toward this reality. And so, just like the British and the French with the Ottoman Empire, we know how that turned out, the making of the modern Middle East. I hope that our leader...
that dysfunction can expand north.
Yeah, and imagine that with nukes, loose chemical weapons. Remember, the Soviet stockpile is still there. And, in fact, it's mostly in the East. So, I mean, that's the worst-case scenario. Best-case scenario is what I said before, which is either a jihadist, somebody who's at least sympathetic to jihad takes over, or another even more crazed Russian nationalist like Zolotov takes over. But I don't think a nationalist could keep that country together at that point. There's too many different groups rising to power.
Here's a question for you. Again, you hear the music probably, but we're going to go to a break. But are there actual Russian nationalists? We hear a lot about them. People describe Vladimir Putin that way, but how big a group is it really? And what is it defined as? And what does that mean for our policy? Brandon Weichert is my guest. I'll be right back. I am Chris Buskirk. He is Seth Leaps, and my guest is Brandon Weichert. He is a contributing editor to American Greatness and the proprietor of the WeichertReport.com. Brandon,
you got some great bumper music, by the way.
Well, thank you. That one was mine. You were not here when we inflicted upon our listening audience the Bee Gees, which yes, we're mass communicating here, and I was eager to let everyone know Seth picked the Bee Gees. I picked the Beastie Boys.
Yes, so do I. So.
Brandon, what are we meant to understand when people describe Vladimir Putin as a Russian nationalist? What does that mean in the current context? And are there any Russian nationalists left anymore?
Well, yeah. So 72% of the Russian population right now are Orthodox Christians. On some level, they openly claim. This is according to a Pew Research survey from 2014. And so you see a lot what Putin is doing when they say a nationalist. I actually say I don't do it in the current context. I do it in the context of Russian history.
Okay, better yet.
That's what you have to do. And so Putin is a Russian national imperialist in the same way that Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great were, the three of the greatest czars that lived in Russian history. And he's no different or worse than those three names that I listed. He's no different or worse than any of the countless czars that existed. So what that means is that Putin believes that his borders are vulnerable. He has the largest land border in the world. He has Europe to his west, the Muslim world to his south, and then he's got the rising Asian world to his east. So he is a man who is consistently aware of the insecurity of his own borders, who's obsessed with securing those borders, and who also understands that he has been dealt a very weak hand. And as Angela Codevilla said at the American Greatness in December, he's played that weak hand masterfully. And what has he done? He has sought to reimpose Russian control over classical geopolitical things that Russia's always controlled. So, for instance, take Crimea. Well, Crimea was traditionally a Russian area. It has the home of the Black Sea Fleet. It is their access to the Black Sea and beyond. So obviously he's not going to let that fall into the EU or NATO's hands, which is exactly what would have happened if he hadn't invaded Crimea and the Donbass. With Syria, he has had since the 70s, Russia has had an air base and a naval base there that they've maintained. Those are critical access points for Russian military. Not that they've been a huge hub of Russian military power, but they're access points. He's not going to let that collapse. He's not going to let that be replaced by either jihadists who will in turn eventually turn their wrath against Russia, and he's certainly not going to let it be captured by pro-American elements. And so, I mean, if you understand that these are classical Jews, Ivan the Terrible expanded Russian territory to the south and to the east because he believed that he could not defend the existing at the time Russian borders.
He needed a buffer zone.
That's right. That's right. And we did the same thing, by the way, when we expanded westward. And you should read John Lewis Gaddis's book, Surprise Security and the American Experience. And it gives great detail into the history of how American expansion on the North American continent was predicated on getting geostrategic depth, creating a buffer zone to protect the original 13 colonies. And so it's the same logic. The same logic. So he's a nationalist in the sense that he wants to preserve that Eastern Orthodox culture. He does not want democracy to reign because democracy has never reigned in Russia before, and he wants to have secured borders. At times that means he'll be rubbing against us the wrong way. At other times, though, most of the time I would argue nowadays, we can actually use Russia as a force multiplier to go after specific jihadist groups like ISIS and to also compete against China to the east.
I think this was the original Trump administration strategy,
it was certainly
right?
Michael Flynn. It was certainly Michael Flynn's plan. I know General Flynn a little bit, and he wrote about this in his book, and he lives up the road here in Alexandria. And he's a good guy, misunderstood and totally wrongly, I think, treated.
Badly mistreated, I think,
yes,
but a smart strategic thinker.
Yeah, he understood. Well, I would say it was a gambit, and of course there are no certainties, and we've never really tried this to the extent that he wanted to try it with Russia, this partnership. But you know what? After having gone through everything we've gone through since the end of the Cold War, the 17-year-long slog in the Middle East, the rise of China, I'm willing to give new innovative ideas at least a go. And I think with Flynn, he was willing to try something new. And Donald Trump, being an innovator, being somebody not possessed of the usual foreign policy elite, mindset that Russia's always an enemy, I think Donald Trump was at least going to give it the old college try. And, of course, now it's all been for naught. And we'll see how everything goes. I mean, we'll see.
Brandon, the two big strategic competitors, enemies, you might say, that the United States has are both right now and in the medium term, and as far as we can tell, in the long term, too, are radical Islam, which is growing throughout the Middle East, but also in other parts of the world, too, and China.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Russia borders both of those
yes.
entities. If you just look at a map, you can see what their borders are. So it is in our interest to be able to work with Russia to further both of our interests simultaneously.
They can also help. They can also help us, by the way, with North Korea and Venezuela, and which is of course imploding right now. So
meanwhile, though, we're taking actions to force them south and east.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Force them away from what's actually in our interest.
Yes. He's going to start, so he's already starting to listen to that neo-Eurasianist group led by Alexander Dugin, who's saying, go east, forget about the West, we're going to align with China, and we're going to become friends with the Muslims, and then we're going to attack the West, because the Dugins of the world, neo-Eurasianism, explicitly states that there must be a actual final battle between the Atlanticists of the West and the neo-Eurasianists in Russia, that there must be an actual war. And in fact, Dugin refers to America as the Antichrist repeatedly throughout his works. I've read all of his books. He's a nut, but he has a lot of influence. And the problem is, the more we keep shutting off contact with the more moderate pro-Western elements in the Kremlin, the harder it's going to be for Putin, who's going to fight to stay in power and will do anything to stay in power. The harder it's going to be for Putin to resist those more radical elements in the neo-Eurasianist wing, saying you have to go east and become basically one with China and one with Turkey and the more radical jihadist elements.
So the big question here is for us as Americans is how do we protect our security? How do we protect our peace and prosperity? And in this context, we look at the people in Washington, to the people in Congress who have recently overwhelmingly passed this Russia sanctions bill. I think the reason Donald Trump didn't veto it is because he was reasonably certain that if he did, his veto would be overridden.
Well, yeah, and as I argued in the piece I just published with you guys, so what? He could have then used that defeat and turned it into a victory in 2018 by saying, look what I'm against, Trump voters. My own party is hemming me in. We need to vote all the bums out, vote every single incumbent out. We need to start draining the swamp, not just in the executive branch, but in the legislative branch as well, because they're the bigger threat.
Brandon, we've got one more short segment.
Sure
so here's what I want you to do. I'm going to ask you to put on your other hat. Explain what's the rationale. What's the best argument from the other side? Because I don't think they've got one. I think I've heard them all. I don't think they've got one. But I'd like to see what you think about that. We're going to come right back with Brandon Weichert, talk more about this. I'm Chris. Seth's out today. We'll be right back. Short segment, so I want to get right back to it. Brandon Weichert is my guest. He is a contributing editor to American Greatness and the proprietor of the Weichert Report. What do you think about that bumper music, Brandon?
I like it a lot. Deep Purple.
That's right. All right. So here's you're going to be the aggressor squadron here in our war game. What are they thinking? This seems like obvious. This seems like diplomacy 101, geopolitics 101. What is the other side? A lot of Republicans, most Republicans, I think, are vehemently anti-Putin, vehemently anti-Russia. The left is as well. The only time they were pro-Russia is when they were communists.
Right.
Why can they not see where our strategic interests lie? What's their argument?
They don't believe that they don't like the civil rights and the human rights violations of Putin's regime. They don't like the fact that he has a history now with Georgia in 2008 and then Ukraine of trying to undermine the world order, sovereignty, not respecting the sovereignty of former Soviet states. They don't like the fact that Putin has been doing cyber attacks. I mean, he has for years. They don't like the fact that Putin has been trying to manipulate the French and the Germans against us, and it's been mostly successful. They don't like the fact that Putin has been using his energy access or his energy resources as a cudgel to make other countries that otherwise would do our bidding no longer doing our bidding. They don't like the fact that he's trying to reassert Russian, power in the Middle East, that he's poking our eye in Latin America. They don't view him as a stabilizing element. They think that he is an irredentist force like China. Even though they want to do business with China, they don't see any value to having any positive relations with Russia. They think that it can be contained and minimized, and so they're going to do everything in their power to do just that. And also, real quickly, there's also an institutional problem. Jeane Kirkpatrick wrote an article called A Normal Country in a Normal Time, in which in 1992, after the Cold War ended, she said that unless we wanted to start another Cold War, and it would be our fault, we needed to, in 1992, stop the perpetuation of the national security state, because all these people understand is fighting Russia. And you saw that for the last 10, 15 years in the war on terror. They keep wanting to turn that into the next Cold War. It didn't work. So now the institutions here are so ingrained in Cold War thinking, they're trying to make Russia yet again into an enemy that it never was.
So, in other words, we have the perennial problem with the national security apparatus fighting the last war.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yep.
Yeah, cold or hot, everybody wants to fight the last one. Brandon, we're just coming up to the end of this segment.
Well, thanks for being so having me.
Yeah, thanks for being so generous with your time.
Very,
very enlightening. Very, very helpful. Brandon, will you send me that Jeane Kirkpatrick article?
Yeah, I got it. Yes.
Yeah, just email it to me later. I have not read that before, but that sounds like it's spot on. Brandon Weichert's been our guest. He is a contributor at American Greatness. Just published something over there within the past hour or two. You'll want to read that. Brandon, can people catch up with you on Twitter?
Yeah, at Brandon Weichert, Weichert.
Very good. Brandon Weichert, thanks so much. We'll be right back.